What's up, guys? Dr. Mo here, digital nomad physician at digitalnomadphysician.com. So today we're going to go over an incredibly boring document list. So this is the master document, and this is actually something that we're putting together for a physician who's starting his own psychiatry practice. It's a virtual psychiatry practice, and so we're working together with an attorney to get this done. All right, so as far as the list, so this is the list of documents that you need both internally and patient facing. So some of this stuff the patient has to actually sign. So kind of starting off at the top of the list, we got comprehensive treatment consent. This is your telehealth consent. This is the patient agreeing to be your patient, forming the patient-doctor relationship. In every state, they have to consent to that. The second one is the notice of privacy practices. So consider this kind of like HIPAA. This one doesn't need a signature. This is all of the details that you have to give them. Some states have their own little details, like California has the CMIA and Michigan has its own thing that you got to give to the patient. They're pretty easy to incorporate. Then, of course, the patient has to sign. So that's kind of the NPPA acknowledgement, and the patient just signs that. So some doctors just have the patient sign the initial one. I don't know, you could do it any way you want. Each attorney does it differently, each practice does it differently. Financial policy, how does the patient pay you? What happens if there's a payment disagreement? Patient bill of rights and responsibilities, all the different things that they're entitled to when they agree to be a patient in your medical practice. Controlled substance patient agreement. So pretty much everybody needs that. Even if you don't prescribe controlled substances, you better tell patients that you don't prescribe controlled substances. Psychotropic medications, we'll go over that. Psychotherapy informed consent. This is especially, so psychotherapy in a lot of states is handled differently than psychiatry. So that's important. So for me, as a family medicine doctor, I actually would probably include health coaching in case that comes up. Medication-specific consents, we'll get into that. Release of information, so especially with psychiatry practices, because the information is so sensitive, you should always have an authorization form for release of information, but it's even more detailed, and you have to reference the laws in your state that dictate that. Termination of care, so of course, anytime you want to discharge a patient, no-show, late cancellation, and of course, payment for that. So for me in my practice, if somebody books an appointment and they don't show up, I keep the money. That's the way it is. I do let them book in the future for free, but that money is forfeited. The next ones are internal documents. So you got office policies and procedures, and the reason is you want to do it the same way for every single patient, so nobody in the future says, oh, you did it for females differently, you did it for Black patients differently, for Middle Easterns. Telehealth emergency crisis, so this is pretty much for everyone. If you see somebody on the call and they're having an acute situation, you want to be able to show that you have a process for handling 911, calling the state trooper, or whatever you need to do. Tech and data security, so this is high-tech stuff, HITECH, not high-tech. We'll get into that. Well, actually, no, we're not going to get into that. The internal documents are self-explanatory, and any attorney can give you boilerplate documents that handle that. They're going to charge you for it, and they're probably edited according to your medical practice. Controlled substance prescribing internally, what do you do, what don't you do, record retention and destruction policies, privacy security breach, that's reportable, by the way, scope of practice delegation for virtual medical assistants, physical medical, well, this is for, I'm doing everything for a virtual medical practice, and then after hours communication. Okay, now let's dive right in. The first one is generic name, the Psych Clinic, comprehensive treatment, consent and telehealth agreement. So we broke it down into these titles so it's easier for the person to navigate. And you can request that the document be written in a very easy to understand manner. It doesn't have to be complicated. Those days are gone, right? You can write things in a way that the patient understands. So what's the purpose of this comprehensive consent? This is to consent to psychiatric evaluation, the telehealth informed consent that's mandatory, the practice rules and expectations from the internal practice, the patient and clinician responsibility, which is dictated by the state medical board, and the scope limitations of care of the provider who provides care. So this might be things that I can and can't do that are outside of my scope. Consent, so Next one is telehealth informed consent. This is, for example, if this physician is actually using Hint Health, but any other, you can make it generic too, because you might switch your electronic health record, which is why it's really nice to have like a date here. And then anytime you change any major thing in your practice, you go back and you update it, and then you label this as V1, V2, V3, version 1, version 2, version 3, and then just keep them in different folders for reference. So telehealth informed consent, that you're gonna, the person has to be physically located, and there's no physical exam that can be done. Active suicidal thoughts, active psychosis, intoxication, any medication. Now, generally, when you get this from an attorney, it's going to have a lot of other generic stuff in it, which is fine. But if you work with an attorney one-on-one, they'll kind of make this very specific to your case. Scope of practice, who do you see, who do you not see, what conditions do you treat, do you not treat, medications that you prescribe and do not prescribe, documentation. So your practice may be required by the state to do certain things. If you're somebody's primary care provider, you may be forced to do their FMLA, right? So you may not, you can say that I don't do it, but you do have to provide ways for the patient to get that. But if you as a physician don't want to do any of that, that's your prerogative. Cash practices, what are you charging? These are some generic numbers, by the way. So what are you charging for your cash? Because this is a cash-based psych practice. How do you communicate with patients? What don't you communicate and not communicate? What is the purpose of the patient portal? Is it HIPAA protected? What things can they and can't do? Some of this stuff is repeated from other documents that we'll go over. But again, you do address it in these kind of vague ways. And then we get into more detailed stuff in the future. What is this one? I just passed over it. Medication policy. So controlled substances, if you have to come get it refilled every 30 days. That's pretty standard for every physician. Disengagement and discharge. So you can't hear back from the patient. The patient doesn't schedule any follow-ups. They're automatically discharged from your practice, but you do still have to mail them a document. So that's it. Limitations of treatment. I think we went over that. Technology and privacy. We'll go over that in the high-tech stuff. Consent to treat and telehealth. So this is the big one that I do agree. I understand the clinic scope, voluntary consent to telehealth services, and then the patient signs it, dates it. Pretty straightforward. And then you as a physician are always signing every patient consent agreement with the patient and dating it. That's the document. The other ones are going to go hopefully a little bit smoother. Don't worry. I know it's a lot of information. So notice of privacy practices. So this is the one that the patient, this is not the signed one. This is just the information you give the patient. This is mandatory, required. And this is the one that the patient will actually sign. So this one is a little bit in depth, but how is your information used? Who else can this information be given to? So for example, this information might be given to court of law, but it's not going to be given to any insurance company in your cash-based medical practice. When it comes to your operations, you might have third-party vendors and software. They're going to have access to the person's name. You, for example, will say that you do or do not deal with an insurance company. So that's, again, the privacy practices of your medical practice. Protected information, what has to be reported if you're a risk to anyone. So mandated reporting, health oversight. So of course, state medical board and federal oversight, substance use related information. So I think this is I don't know which one that is. Use and disclosure requiring your authorization. So anytime the patient's protected health information has to be shared with something else, you do still need the patient's consent, right? You do want to communicate that to them. So they should know that if you're sharing this information with another physician, you tell them what your rights are as a patient, right to request amendments. So this is their right to edit their chart if needed. Confidentiality. So this is the CMIA law that I mentioned. Each state is going to have its own little confidentiality and privacy policy stuff that you want to incorporate. So these things are heavily protected in California, and they have to be addressed exactly as it is in California. Electronic communication and telehealth privacy is inside the privacy practices, the NPP document. For any kind of minor stuff, you do have to address it, even if you don't see minors. So, for example, I don't see minors in my practice, but I do address it. Every once in a while, I'll see a minor in my practice, I should say, but I don't generally see minors in my practice. Breach notification, if their protected health information, their PHI, is somehow compromised. And that's it. Pretty straightforward on this one. The next one is just saying, hey, did you read everything in that document? Here's a quick summary, sign it, and consent to it, right? And financial policy and payments. So this is, again, just kind of generic. What is it you do? What is it you don't do? What is your cash-based model? How might it be different than what the average patient expects? That's a very important thing to put in your medical documents that in your patient-facing documents that the patient signs. So how much are you charging an hour? Do you have 15-minute appointments, 30-minute appointments? Are they with video, audio? Is it always HIPAA protected? How are you making payments? What if you cancel? Do you get a refund? Good faith estimates are required by a lot of states. Super bills, if somebody, obviously, well, all of this would be out of network because it's cash-based. Medicare notice required. So this part is saying that you will not see somebody over the age of 65 or who's enrolled in Medicare. So obviously you have to disclose that. So this is kind of like your prior authorization, medication limitations that you don't do, controlled substances, any lab requirements that you have. This has to go in there because it could be something that financially financially affects the patient. Any admin fees that you might include separately. Financial policy and payment agreement, I'm not sure why communication response thing is here. You'll see we'll go into that in more detail. What happens in non-payment, termination of care, for which we have another separate document. And then the patient acknowledges it, signs it, and that's the end of that. The next one is the patient bill of rights and responsibilities. So this is, here, this document explains the rights and responsibilities of the patient receiving care from the psych clinic, a virtual cash-based medical practice. This document is required by federal law, California law, and accepted standards of psych ethics. So what are the rights that the patient has? Under what circumstances will that patient lose those rights? When can they be circumvented? In case of like a legal matter, or if the patient is placing themselves in harm's way or somebody else is in harm's way. Informed consent, their ongoing access, so their Bill of Rights is their ongoing access to their medical chart. Their information in that chart is always theirs, right? Safe and appropriate care. So when do they have to be referred to a specialist? How will that be handled? If the physician leaves the practice, what happens? What's the timeline and procedures to get that patient to somewhere else? Again, telehealth laws have to be communicated in this document. The communication pattern with the patient. Complaints and grievances, who can you turn to? Usually put something here about state medical boards. I'm not sure why that's not here. Or regulatory agency, but you actually, the way I've seen this document is you actually put State Medical Board of California. This is their phone number. This is where you can report any issues. Patient responsibilities, following treatment plans, meaning that if the patient did not return your calls, did not follow the treatment plans, you are no longer responsible, or they lose their patient-doctor relationship. Telehealth safety, respectful communication. This is a lot of stuff that kind of builds up to if you need to discharge a patient, for which, again, we have a document. Financial responsibility, controlled substance compliance, emergency phone numbers, and the patient signs. And that's it. The physician doesn't sign this because there's no patient-doctor thing, right? This is just all the Bill of Rights that you communicate that's required to you federally and by state. Psych clinic, controlled substances, patient agreement. This is going to be different for a lot of you guys, but think about if you prescribe testosterone or if you prescribe phentermine. Those things are going to fall into controlled substances. So, which ones do you give? Which ones do you not give? For example, as a family medicine doctor, if you're not managing anxiety with short-acting benzos or any benzos, if you definitely don't do that, that has to go into your documentation. Don't forget, because the patient needs to know that before they come in. It's only fair. Patient responsibilities when it comes to controlled substances. There's policies here about if the patient loses their medication or falls in the toilet and immediately disintegrates, any prohibited behavior, violent behavior, monitoring requirements from the state. So this is going to be different. All the PDMPs are different for every state. They have different portals and things that you have to handle. Refill policy, telehealth conditions, communication rules, discontinuation of controlled substances, so under what circumstances, termination of care if these things are breached, and the patient signs and acknowledges. The clinician signs it here too. I'm not quite sure why. I haven't seen, usually the clinician doesn't sign this, but if you do, this might be the one that you're actually giving when you start somebody on a controlled substance. This physician, I don't think he does any controlled substances, but I don't remember the details. Informed consent for psychotropic medication. So this is a separate one. So this is one that I think is required by most states for prescribing any kind of mood medication. And then you must, again, list what you do and don't treat, the benefits, the harms, the risks, the side effects. If you prescribe medications off-label, that's where this goes, informing the patient that that's what you do, required monitoring with any lab tests that you will follow, pregnancy, breastfeeding, patients who are suicidal, young kids, like minors. Those are all important things that you have to include. I don't think we have a minors chapter here because it's not relevant. Telehealth specific limitations. You may not give a medicine in a telehealth visit if, I don't know, for whatever reason. Patient responsibilities, acknowledgement and consent, and clinician signature. Again, this one, I'm not sure why the clinician is signing this one. Psychogenic psychotherapy, informed consent. So this is the one where you're discussing psychotherapy specifically, which I mentioned is very strictly managed by each state separately from general psychiatry. And for me, for example, I have a telehealth consent that, I have a health coaching consent that's very separate from my primary care stuff. So if I'm just doing health coaching, it's very separate, especially because I do health coaching for people who are not in the US and they're not even they're not residents of the state that I'm licensed in. It's general. We don't give any prescriptions, no diagnosis. It's general medical advice. So therapy modalities provided, EMDR, CBTI, whatever, all the standard stuff that the risks and benefit, confidentiality, documentation, appointment times, how much you charge, emergency crisis, termination of therapy, blah, blah, blah. So next one, medication management and refill policy. So I know this is very similar to the other ones, but this is kind of your general medication policy. And again, you're going to probably incorporate a lot of the, I don't prescribe this, I don't prescribe that. You can't just request a refill without seeing me every 3 months, all of that stuff. So purpose of this policy, medications the practice does not prescribe, refill timeframes, how to refill, what ways you can communicate with the patient, with the doctor. So social media, obviously not very appropriate. I hope it's that, will not be processed. Appointment requirements for refills, controlled substance refills, pharmacy issues, early refills, lost or stolen medication. We've mentioned that, travel, etc. I don't think there's any more. Is there? Oh, this one is longer. Medication changes and patient responsibilities, clinician right to decline refills. That's a big one. I highly recommend having something in there. I have something pretty in-depth about that in my policy documents. And then, this is not signed either. This is just something you share with the patient. Authorization for release of information. This is standard. I'm not going to go over it. It's very basic. Just patient has to sign it. Who's it go to? Who's the responsible party? What's the purpose of this release to sign? And then termination of care. Under what specific reasons, right? Because you don't want somebody to say, hey, you're discharging all your minority patients, what gives, or all your poor patients. It's got to be consistent. Reason for termination, not engagement, violation of clinic policies, abusive behavior. What termination of care includes. So what you might do, you might bridge them with some medication, you might refer them to a different provider. The patient responsibility during the transition. If there is immediate if there is a need for immediate termination of care, why might that happen? An acknowledgement. This one, the patient has to, no, this one the patient doesn't have to sign. This is just something that they come in with off the bat. So, sorry, I know this is kind of frustrating to see such a big list, but I hope now it makes more sense, this list that we have here. About, 12 documents, give or take. You can combine these. So what you can do is you can combine all the documents into one thing, into one PDF that the patient signs on your portal. So this physician is using Hind Health. Another physician was using Charm, recently switched to Charm. I use Healthy. Previously, I was using Acute Health. So it's just a PDF. The patient clicks their name, and that's the signature. That's the end of it. And this is the list of documents that I mentioned that you would have internally and always keep updated. All right, guys, take care.